All right. Welcome, everyone, to the 10th session of Foreign Affairs with Future Leaders. My name is Alad Raymond, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Onair Institute. Today, I'm really thankful to be with you, and I'm joined by my co-host, Agastya Bhatia. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over some quick procedural information before I turn it over to Agastya to introduce us to the topic and to introduce our speaker for today. So as always, please show respect for all peers and all topics discussed. Challenge yourself to keep an open mind. Please approach the material professionally and analytically, and be sure to keep your questions pertinent to the discussion at hand. If you do have a question at any point, you can go ahead and raise your hand using the participant feature, or you can send me a message in the chat box. Please do keep your mic muted unless it's your turn to speak. And when you do speak, we'd love it if you could share your name and where you're calling from. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to my co-host now to introduce our topic.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So as two of the strongest and most quickly rising economic and military powers in Asia, the relationship between China and India has enormous implications for evolving regional power dynamics and international security. This year, the two giants faced off in a series of border escalations, especially along the disputed line of actual control, also called the LAC, which has served as the de facto frontier between the two states since the war between them in 1962. These skirmishes, which have been violent at times, broke out over a backdrop of heightened economic competition between India and China, as well as the increasing contention for influence in the Indian Ocean and South Asia. In this discussion, we will speak about developments in the recent standoff, why relations between Beijing and New Delhi may never be the same, and what these shifts could mean for the region and beyond. And today we are very lucky to welcome Dr. Deepa Ollapally to the FAFL program. Dr. Ollapally is a political scientist specializing in Indian foreign policy, India-China relations, and Asian regional and maritime security. She is a research professor of international affairs and the associate director of the Sagur Center. She also directs the Rising Powers Initiative, a major research program which tracks and analyzes foreign policy debates in aspiring powers of Asia and Eurasia. Dr. Ollapally is currently working on a funded book titled Big Power Competition for Influence in the Indian Ocean Region, which assesses the shifting patterns of geopolitical influence by major powers in the region since 2005 and the drivers of these changes. She's the author of 5 books, including Worldviews of Aspiring Powers, published in 2012, and The Politics of Extremism in South Asia in 2008. Dr. Ollapally has also held senior positions in the policy world, including the US Institute of Peace in DC and the National Institute of Advanced Science Studies in Bangalore, India. She holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University. And I'll let Dr. Ollapally take the mic now.
All right, properly unmuted. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming on a Sunday afternoon when there's so many other things you could be doing. Not really, right? So anyway, it's a pleasure to see all of you. Some of you I know from class and elsewhere. And so, I thought today we could just have a kind of a conversation after I lay out a few points. And Elad and Agastya, I know you both have, I've had some professional contact with you. They're both real stars. So I hope your initiative goes well in the future. So I want to just lay out 3 sort of big themes, and then these guys have prepared some questions for me, which I will get into after that. So let me just ask the question, first of all, one, how did these 2 countries end up here in the middle of the pandemic? Okay. A second question is, what has changed in the India-China relations after this crisis? Crisis hasn't ended, but kind of the worst seems to be over. So a little bit of time we can look back. And finally, just looking ahead, what I see are some of the things to watch out for. Okay, so the first question, how do the 2 countries end up here in the middle of this pandemic? And Agastya related a little bit to that, but one thing I want to mention is that, I'm not going to go into the history and so forth. We have no time for that. But there is a more than 2,100-mile border between these two countries up in the Himalayas, and they have not been demarcated on the ground in all the places, nor have they been delineated on a map that both agreed to on all sectors. There are three sectors: the Western, Middle, and Eastern. The middle sector is pretty much all right between the two, but the Western and the Eastern are under contention. Now, so there's a lot of room for miscalculation and ambiguity. Okay, so let me just start with that point. And a lot of room for taking advantage of it, right? The China, in this case, China has had border conflicts and disputes with 14 other countries. It has resolved 13 of them. Guess which country it has not resolved it? India. So you have to ask the question, why is it that it hasn't been able to resolve that one country? And also, to make matters a little bit more pointed, for example, on the eastern sector where India and China has not accepted the Indian control over Arunachal Pradesh, a state which China considers South Tibet. Well, that is the leftover from British boundary drawings, which it's called the McMahon line, generally accepted as the line between the two on that sector. But China has not accepted that, although the same logic doesn't apply in its relations with Myanmar, because it has accepted the McMahon line with Myanmar. So again, that is just to say, why is it not, what are we waiting for in order to settle the border dispute? So we can come back to that, but a lot of reasons I could point out. One could be that there's a big gap in the infrastructure capabilities of these two. So perhaps somebody's waiting until that gap keeps growing and growing, and therefore you can make a better deal at the end of it. Okay, so but also maybe to put pressure on India to keep that pot boiling as another reason for why it has not gone ahead, because India in this case has been asking repeatedly to try and resolve the border all at once. Not going to happen right now. So there's an ambiguity on the border itself. So that creates a certain amount of, of contention that's going to happen. But a second point, as far as how they got here, is that changing strategic conditions, capabilities of these two states, rising ambitions. Agastya again mentioned the rising powers, two important powers. Both are gaining, not just in military capabilities, but in their ambitions. And in this case, China has got the Western sector, which is where the current crisis is happening, which is Western sector for China, the Eastern Ladakh for India. But it happens to be in a strategic location, new strategic location, because of the Belt and Road Initiative that Xi Jinping has announced, because of the fact that it's close to sensitive areas. These sensitive areas is close to the pipelines and a corridor, economic corridor between Xinjiang all the way down to Gwadar port in the Arabian Sea in Pakistan. So the strategic ambitions are changing, and therefore the importance of some of these, no man's land, really, when you look at it, it's high Himalayas, really treacherous mountainous regions. Unless you're a real ambitious, hiker type or mountaineer, who cares in one sense, right? Unless you want to get frozen up there, because that's usually what will happen. But it's taken on more of an importance now that these projects and so forth are underway. But there's also the question of leadership. The border disputes and skirmishes have heated up a bit more since 2012, 2013. Just so happens to coincide with the rise of Xi Jinping. And so one could see some correlation between the way in which his ambitions are also playing out. He was the author of the BRI, of course, And so you see some leadership, and I have to say, the coming to power of Prime Minister Modi in India, who has a hard nationalist kind of approach and has promised more what you call, a bolder, more military oriented capabilities for India to play a bigger role, more powerful presence, and so forth. So there are a lot of these issues that are coming together to have made this dispute flare up. But technically, what happened is that the Chinese crossed over in May along a number of different areas. And again, maybe you're all familiar with a little bit of this, that's why you're here. But where they came into an area in Eastern Ladakh and near Galwan Valley and several other 4 or 5 other areas that had been contested and had been, India had seen several of those as lying on its side of the line of actual control. And therefore it was seen as China having transgressed into Indian territory. Now, the problem here from the Chinese perspective is that Indians responded much more strongly than it had in the past. Therefore, you suddenly had a major crisis, including casualties, which had not happened since 1975, which should tell you something about, changing conditions, which is what I'll now come to. What has changed in India-China relations after this crisis? Number one is what I just said, casualties. That has been something that they have been able to avoid from 1975 onwards, even though they fought a war in 1962. And of course, there was a loss of life there. And by the way, it was in 1962 in a surprise attack by the Chinese, when the Chinese took control over the area that is currently under dispute, the Aksai Chin in the western part of China, which is a strategic location because it runs along the road between Xinjiang and Tibet goes through that. So that's a very, very important sector. But point is that that it happened in this area, but they had not had casualties. 20 Indian soldiers killed in June, which kind of changed the whole the entire scene suddenly changed, especially in the Indian domestic context. People were up in arms about this, and a big distrust in the Chinese have taken hold across the board, I think. It also saw escalation. So now you see this notion that, things are now escalating, unlike in the past. And they don't really have a great mechanism to deal with it immediately, because they had been kind of complacent, I would say, that somehow this would just sort of die down and then go back to things as normal. Well, it's a little bit more difficult after you've had deaths and more kind of risk-taking. So you see a higher level risk-taking. You also see, I wrote a paper on the way in which these crises in the past have ended, which I call face-saving, where both of these countries, it's very interesting when you look at how they wound down the previous crises and how they were able to not negotiate out of it really, but keep a huge level of ambiguity to the point where observers don't exactly know what the exact terms of the agreement were. All we kept hearing was that it goes back to status quo ante, and therefore, but it was a way to just sort of wriggle out of this mess, blame it on, misperception, ambiguity on the ground, and get on with it. This time, a little bit more difficult. There are many more eyes on the ground, a lot more observers and so forth who are questioning. So they're going to have a little bit more tough time just to kind of come out of this without a clear winner, loser, and so forth, which they avoided. Even the term winner, loser was avoided, very hard. Well, I just another point quickly is that the Chinese pressure and the Chinese push this time, and I think it has sent the Indian side a strong signal to it, which has created a kind of a shift in strategic thinking in India toward a more realist thinking. You're all international relations students, so you know exactly what I'm talking about then, where previously, India was really much more focused on diplomacy, much less on coercion, military use of force, and so forth. India seems to have shed that for the moment, and therefore you see a much greater willingness to push. And in fact, for instance, what they did was, one of the things that happened was that while the crisis has been going on since May, June, you had the major clash in Galwan where 20 Indians died. By the way, there's reports that Chinese soldiers died as well, but there's nothing about it. They're just not saying anything, so we don't know. But because the talks, there had been military to military commanders talks and so forth that had been going on all summer, they reached an impasse. And in August, late August, India actually had a forward push to occupy several plateaus, several hills, I should say, that I think Chinese didn't expect. Well, that's what I'm talking about in terms of what the things have changed. Now, you would not have expected this to happen in previous cases. So the Indians have been pushing forward as well. And so, you get now more risk-taking, more an escalation, less holding back. So it's all leading toward a more dangerous situation going forward. And so much less easy to read. Now, so coming to that final point, looking ahead, the first challenge that I see, or the first order of business really, is managing de-escalation. You're going to have, how do you get to the de-escalation? How do you make sure that the de-escalation agreements that you come up with are actually going to be implemented properly? And so we can go into that a little bit if you want to. But the good news is that since September, since that Indian push in August, late August, which I think kind of woke up the other side a bit, there have been some major breakthroughs. First, between the two foreign ministers at a meeting, virtual meeting that was hosted by Russia. It's called the Russia, India, China, the BRIC, without the B in this case. But at that meeting, these two guys put their heads together and came up with a 5-point plan to de-escalate and to disengage. That, again, was kind of, hemming and hawing, and nothing was really happening until just last week. The military commanders, following guidance from the top leaders, have been holding several rounds of talks, 8 to be exact, and they just finished the 8th one, and they have announced a big breakthrough in terms of how they're going to actually disengage. And at first sight, it looks very promising. But again, the devil is in the details in all of these things. And by the way, one of the biggest threats to both China and India right now in maintaining a really bold position there, winter. The temperatures right there are 20 below. It's not going to get better. These guys are going to have to, each one has about 50,000 troops. So that's the other thing I should say. In terms of the higher and higher number of troops deployed, has never been like this in the past, 50,000 each. And so are they going to expend the kind of money and equipment and so forth necessary to keep them all in the open air there in 20 below, 30 below? Well, I think that's one of the reasons that they're like trying to really hurry up some kind of a disengagement process there. The other thing is that, there are limits to how much in the Indian side, it can push the Chinese and vice versa. But because of the gap in capabilities, how much can India do in terms of punishing China in this case? There are a lot of strategic analysts who are talking about maybe India should make the LAC, i.e., the border with China, look more like the LOC, which is the border with Pakistan, line of control. In other words, have constant patrolling, much more militarized and so forth. So that is a big step to, and it's, if you're thinking of LOCIing the LAC, big step. And I think that's going to be extraordinarily costly. And again, but this is what the Chinese have, in some sense, pushed India to consider. These were not things that they were being really taken seriously. And this is being taken. So that's one of the things that when you look ahead, we're going to have to see what's going to happen. But I'm going to leave you with one final thing about, I think, what's going to be the biggest question that will dog India and China. And because some of you are, as students, let me just put it to you in academic terms. The question is, should India, in this case, be pushing for a more local deterrence on the ground and increase its capability to deter the Chinese from further incursions? Or should it be looking at its opposite, avoiding a spiral? You all know about security dilemma and the spiral that can happen. So what should be the pathway forward, deterrence or spiral? And I think it is a difficult question, and the Chinese know it as well. And so I'm going to leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that very, very thorough explanation of how things have been going. And before we get into the question portion of this event, I should mention that we'll be recording our discussion. So if you know of anyone who wasn't able to make it, we'll be able to share our discussion with them as well and make sure we're getting people informed on a very, very critical issue in international affairs and international security. So the first question that I have for you, just in discussing the conflict more generally, is in this border conflict, what would be the best case scenario for each of the countries involved? And to what extent do you think that each country would need to alter its current approach in order to achieve those goals?
Okay, so let me just say immediate best case scenario. If you look at on the ground, from the Chinese perspective, I think it would be to freeze the situation as is. Freeze it because they have the advantage. As I said, in terms of just capabilities, armory, weapon systems, tanks, you name it, they have a much higher number of these capabilities because, they have been focusing on high range Himalayan warfare because of Tibet. And so they have from estimates of 13 divisions versus India has 2 mountain divisions, just to give an example. So if you were to freeze, say, the number of troops on the border, the all-weather building, all-weather road building, keeping certain structures intact and so forth, and that for India, it would be in the immediate case to go back to status quo ante, go back to April, pull back, give up some of the forward areas that the Chinese have come into, and pull back. All right, so that would be a kind of immediate, status quo ante for India, and keep it as is after the status quo, post status quo for the Chinese. But beyond that, if you think about, just a broader issue would be for to try and settle the damn thing. And for India, it would be, I think, in its best case scenario would be for China to say, all right, you know what, we've done this with 13 countries, let's sit down and hammer this out. Because as long as this is going to keep going, the skirmishes are going to go on. And this way, India can get an agreement where it can then build up its capabilities without having the kind of salami tactics, in a sense, that the Chinese are doing in terms of, moving a few kilometers forward in the forward move, and then maybe agreeing to go back, but sometimes coming back, as they apparently have done in 2017. So to put an end to that, so just on the board, I would say that. I mean, I could, obviously there are other things that one can do, can make some kind of big economic grand bargain and decide to go with the BRICS pathway and so forth. But just to stick to the border issue, that's what I would say.
Great, thank you. I'll take the next question, which is how will this escalation impact other facets of Sino-Indian relations, particularly foreign investment, competition in the Indian Ocean, and international trade?
Okay, well, let me start with the investment and trade, the economics, because one of the things that has been a challenge now, post-crisis, which I meant to mention, is that so far, India and China have managed to keep the economic and strategic realms separate. They've been able to isolate those two. They're not the only ones. China has been doing that with Southeast Asian countries, Japan, and so forth, where strategically they have a rivalry, but economically they're cooperating. I read an article on that, some of you read. So, but this time, Prime Minister Modi did something uncharacteristic, as you may know. He took some economic sanctions against China. So he banned TikTok, WeChat, and first I think it was 29 apps, and then he went on to more than several hundred apps and so forth. So this was something that was maybe not it doesn't make a huge difference, but symbolically huge, because he crossed the line in terms of in terms of being willing to now bring the economic stick. But there are issues there because I guess you asked the question about investment and trade. Question is, who's this going to hurt? And who's more dependent on the other? Because, you've got to have some cards to play if you're going to do this. Or you have to be willing to suffer. You have to be willing to accept the suffering. And that also shows a certain amount of resolve, I suppose. So that's also another issue. Maybe you're willing to suffer the consequences. But on the other hand, at the same time that after Modi came into power in 2015, we have seen a rise in Chinese investments, by the way, quite dramatically. So I think it was in 2014, there was only about a billion or so investments, but by 2018, it had gone up, actually even more than that. It had gone up to $8 billion by 2018. So it's 4, 5, 6 times higher than it was earlier. Also, the Chinese investments are being moving away from government, the state-owned enterprises, to private Chinese companies, Alibaba, Tencent. These are big, big companies, and they are investing in many of the, especially in the Indian startup world. Okay, the Indian unicorns. So 2/3 of Indian so-called unicorns have Chinese investment in them. Now, not just in this, but, and I want, because this is an important point, I just wanted to spend a little time on this. The power sector, for example, 3 out of 4 power companies projects in India have Chinese equipment. Not because they love the Chinese or the Chinese equipment, but it's cheaper, 3 to 4 times less than European or Western or any other countries' equipment. These are all things that, okay, also even Alibaba, I think has a great deal of investment in the parent company of something called Paytm, which is India's main online payment system. In fact, the Indian Parliament, there was a question raised about the data protection of Paytm, and it turns out that the Paytm stores all its data in local servers, it doesn't send it abroad. But look, the issue is that there's a huge amount of investment coming in with even more potential in infrastructure and so forth. And, yeah, you could say, you could crack down on it. On the other hand, there's another way to think about it, and that is that it gives Alibaba, Tencent, all these companies that do business in India, it gives it certain incentive to try and come through to try to tamp down crises with the Chinese, for example, to facilitate better. And maybe India can leverage this in other areas, on the border, for example. When it comes to trade, huge trade imbalance in China's favor, okay? And right now, if India puts trade restrictions, let me just tell you that 62% of India's pharmaceutical inputs come from China. That's a huge, okay? So can you really do that? So all I want to say is that the Prime Minister has taken a tough stand on this. I think it's more symbolic. Long way to say that I think that that the economics is still going to be somewhat protected. And the post-pandemic world, listen, every country is going to try to build up its economics. That's going to be front and center. Not, I think the border issues are going to have to take a second seat. I do want to mention one thing though, and you asked me because you said not just also the Indian Ocean. That's a huge question, but I'll just say one thing about it, and I can talk more if there's any other questions on it. But because there is a gap in capability between the two countries on the border, territorially, China holds an advantage. But in the Indian Ocean, India holds the advantage. So what I see happening is, rather than perhaps building up and pouring money into the border areas on China's side, India's side, it will have what I call a maritime hedge. It will put more money into where it has advantage and to shore that up, rather than trying to do both, because China can simply pour more money and outgun it on the border. It's not a pragmatic approach for an India that is constrained right now. So but on the other hand, I think, the one advantage, by the way, that India has on the border, in the Himalayas, in the cold, in the freezing cold, is that they have had a lot more practice with Pakistan. They've actually fought on these high ranges and so forth in Kashmir, whereas the Chinese have not. They have a lot of equipment, they have a lot of money, but in terms of battle readiness, a lot less. But you need more than just the troops and training. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I'm really glad that you went into the economics and the aspects of this relationship, as we say in the title of the event, beyond the border, right? Because nothing exists in a vacuum, and that's something that we really need to recognize as students and as professionals in international affairs. And in the same vein of nothing being in a vacuum, I think it's also important to look at how this relates to grand strategy, say for China, for example. So I'm wondering if you could talk about where the border dispute between India and China fits into China's greater territorial strategies, like its activities in the South China Sea and elsewhere?
Yeah, this is a question that if you read Foreign Affairs and you're reading, everybody is, all the analysts are trying to actually pinpoint and figure out just what Chinese thinking is on its grand strategy. And the consensus increasingly seems to be that under Xi Jinping, there has been a shift, and that the Chinese ambitions have no longer being held in check for a variety of reasons, but that it is now, China is coming out not just regionally, but globally. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the best example of that. But beyond that, the fact that during the pandemic, which of course, there's a black cloud hanging over the Chinese role in it, especially in the beginning, that the fact that they were still willing to engage in simultaneously gray zone tactics in the South China Sea, Hong Kong, cracking down on Hong Kong national security law and moving against democratic movement there. Taiwan, putting additional pressure on Taiwan, not allowing Taiwan to participate in the WHO, again, in the middle of a pandemic, even as an observer, and then on the Indian border. When you look at it in a totality, it certainly seems that the Chinese are pursuing a certain pattern here that has been a departure, in a sense, from its earlier period. So I think it is saying something. On the other hand, I want to say that, the Chinese also have to prioritize. They can't be having multiple pressure points at the same time. And so the South China Sea is clearly their core interest. If you look at the map, wherever they want to go, you got to get out through the South China Sea in terms of its maritime interests. And so to get to the Indian Ocean, South China Sea is important. The US is the biggest naval power parked in its neighborhood. It has to deal with that. It has a problem with Japan in the East China Sea. So I think when you look at it in terms of priorities, even though there's a pattern of more assertiveness by the Chinese, you certainly cannot say that they're going to have, they're going to do everything at the same time with the same intensity. So I think in that case, the Indian border is going to be lower level than the others. So I think we can't jump to the conclusion that, this is that we can draw a immediate, extrapolate immediately from what's happening in the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. And as I said, the Indian Ocean is a totally different place than the South China Sea in terms of capabilities. And not just because of neighborhood, but also because of allies and so forth that partners India has there. So yeah, grand strategy, but you can't have it all at the same time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So the next question is, it's a very hypothetical one. I think more people might be interested in hearing this, is how much of an escalation do you think this conflict would have to have for the US to get involved? And how could the US relationship with India or China affect its potential involvement?
Okay, well, this triangle, the India, US, China triangle, is getting more and more tight, shall I say, in the sense that what happens in one leg of the triangle is affecting the other leg a lot more than it used to in the past. And it didn't have as much of an impact because the Indians had longstanding non-alignment, strategic autonomy. It was not willing to join any alliances. And so it held a certain level of distance from going in and being seen as part of a tight alliance with the United States. So this question of what would it take for the US to get involved was kind of a non-starter because, well, it was sort of like never almost, because India was not going to be welcoming of it, and that didn't make any sense. Having said that, one of the key things that has happened, and again, when I said what has changed, one big thing after this crisis is a much closer links between India and the United States. And in fact, it has signed a pretty controversial agreement with the US called BECA, which is an agreement that shares geospatial intelligence sharing. And that is something that India had been not willing to sign because it's almost as if you're now joining with the US coalition. Okay, so, but they already signed logistics agreements and communications agreements and so on already in the pipeline. So now this last one, it's a foundational agreement. And so it is becoming a very key partner for the United States. Now, of course, we have a new president, but let me just stay on this question of what would it take for a US to be involved in this and for India to give up its non-alignment, its strategic. It would be a showdown with the Chinese. It would be a showdown that showed that there was no point of return, meaning you couldn't de-escalate that easily. You couldn't disengage, and that there was bad faith bargaining all around. And that trust had then fallen to the point where, forget what the foreign ministers are trying to do, it's not happening on the ground, and that there is essentially, they no longer can negotiate themselves out of this. I think it has gotten to the point where the Chinese have actually been pushing the border incursions to the point where it's dangerously close to that, where India is almost, I think, ready to look to US involvement. Now, what kind of involvement would that be is a totally different thing. I seriously don't think that the US would get involved in any kind of open military, but certainly they can make life more difficult for the Chinese, just in terms of even symbolically, at the United Nations, for example, or like Donald Trump did in a ham-fisted way, say that, oh, we're ready to, be a mediator. And both China and India were like, no, thanks. Okay, but should the conditions rise to the level where the US gets involved, I would say that would be an epic failure of Chinese diplomacy. Because the very last thing that the Chinese want is for US and India to form a kind of a very tight alliance. That would be a historic failure for them. And I think they will try their best not to let that happen. So I'm not answering the question directly, but there it is.
Just as direct an answer as we could get for that, such a question like that. So thank you very much for that. So at this point, we're going to open up to audience questions. And we have quite a few of you who have already sent that via chat. So I'll go ahead and get to as many as possible. And if you have a question as well and you'd like to raise your hand, please feel free to do so with the participants feature. So we have a couple questions about South Asian players, other South Asian players. So I'd like to kind of consolidate those into one question. So how could the escalation of tensions between India and China change the strategic alliances of other South Asian countries, namely Sri Lanka and Pakistan? And how has India's approach to China changed by Chinese connections to players in South Asia?
Yeah, that's a really good question, an important question, and one of the things that I'm going to look at in my book. So it has been changing because in the past, until about mid-2000s, China was really not a player in South Asia. And now China has become one of the most important player. In fact, often outdoing India in places like Sri Lanka. Now, Pakistan is a different story because since the 60s, 1960s onwards, they have been a special relationship, and India has basically given up on, that's sort of lost to the Chinese. But all the other states, and especially some of the island states, not just the Sri Lanka, but Maldives, tiny country, but strategically becoming more and more important. And I think these countries do not, their worst case scenario would be if India and China had a complete breakup. Would be, if they were forced to choose between these two rising countries, that would be a disaster for them. So they've been trying to play a very delicate game of not kind of, getting each, not provoking either one. But, that's becoming harder and harder. It's becoming harder and harder because you see in things like, the border issues are spilling over into other arenas now. And not just with China and India, but the United States and Japan, and especially, are also getting involved in these countries. So Sri Lanka and the Maldives, United States just signed an agreement with the Maldives. Why? Obviously it's because it wants to give them an alternative. So the question is, they may not want to choose, but they will have to diversify. And I happened to, a couple of years ago, I happened to meet the then exiled president of Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, and I was talking and I was interviewing him, and I asked him about, as a small country, how do you navigate between China and India? And you know what he said? He said, look, we have to be realistic. He said, essentially, when we look at our geography, we have to have an India first policy. That's just a reality. I talked about the geographical disadvantage for China in Indian Ocean. Yeah, that's basically, it's a matter of, it'll take quite a long time for the Chinese to get to the Indian Ocean if there's a disaster. For example, all the disaster relief things have come, India has been the first responder in its region. So, and I think what India wants to do now is to bring more Japanese investments and so forth, as a way to shore up its own limited capabilities, let me put it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up players like Australia and Japan and that, because we have another submitted question asking specifically about India's participation in the Quad Group and the Malabar Naval exercises. And if you could talk a little bit about how this kind of collaboration with these players could impact India's existing relationship with China.
Yeah, good question, because the Quad also has seen some big changes in the last year or so. Again, thanks to the Chinese. And by the way, this is where, again, I see this as a failure of Chinese foreign policy, Chinese diplomacy, that they are tightening this partnerships against them. But leaving that aside, the Quad itself has been an idea, as some of you know, more than actually a fleshed out actual partnership or alliance system. It's not any of those. In part because all four of those countries, US, Japan, India, China, India, Japan, and Australia, the four, all have different interests at any given point in time. But right now, when we look at it, they all seem to have come to the consensus that they need to coordinate their responses more, and that it has to be something that is taking on the China challenge, if not targeting China. And I have to tell you, they had a meeting recently that was held in Tokyo. The Quad met in Tokyo. And the statement that came out at the end from these, first of all, the United States was the only one that came out sort of, very strongly against China, naming China and listing its transgressions and so forth. The others did not. Japan, India, Australia kept mum. They didn't use the word China. So yes, they're growing closer and they're coordinating, but these three are still being a little pragmatic because they don't want to be, one of the dangers is that they don't want the United States to drag them into something that they're not ready for, or that they have some incentives economically to play ball with China, which makes sense. The Malabar exercises, yes, the addition of Australia into it is actually a big deal because it has been so far India, US, and Japan. And, and they have held these things in the South China Sea, in the Bay of Bengal. It's all over. So that's also sending a very strong signal. And if you are China, you should be sitting up and taking stock of that.
Absolutely.
Because it allows interoperability and, so on, that even without an alliance system, if you can quickly come together for missions, then that's a big step.
Thanks for that. So I see that we're running low on time, so we do have time for one more question before I ask you for some closing thoughts. So Max, I saw that you've raised your hand, so if you want to unmute and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, first of all, Professor Ollapally, thank you so much for coming and giving this talk to us. It's been really fascinating. I'm Max Kaplan. I'm the president of the Delta Phi Epsilon Foreign Service Fraternity at GW. My question is kind of related to about the sort of general question about how alliances between the various South Asian players have kind of shifted as a result of this. My question is, as a result of like the more kind of realist lens that you say like the Modi government has been adopting kind of as a result of increased tensions with China, or at least applying to those increased tensions, have we seen like more like diplomatic efforts by the Indian government in those other South Asian countries to do, like you said, would be their worst case scenario, like pressuring them to lean more towards India? And also even outside of South Asia, like has there been like linkages to other issues that China cares about outside of necessarily economics, like Taiwan, for example?
Yeah, very good question. The India does have certain levers and leverage points that they have over their neighbors. Trade, for example, because there is a South Asian free trade agreement that they've been trying to get off the ground. Many of these countries in the region would like to have access to the Indian market. So India has some leverage over that. Again, India has also in the past, in Sri Lanka, for example, shown that it will intervene if, in fact, things get to the point where Indian interests are threatened in one way or the other. So there is a history there that these countries know. And so at the same time, they're all democracies and there are competing parties in these countries. And one thing that's happened is that because the Chinese have come in and they have such deep pockets, two things have happened. One, it has not all been wonderful economic miracles. There's been debt trap, there's been dependencies, sovereignty issues, and so forth. And so you're seeing different interest groups emerge in these countries, one that's more pro-China, one that's more pro-India. So the Indians have been really strongly trying to promote those groups that are more favorable through a variety of means, and trying to push back and promote democracy, because a lot of the ones that are now pro-India happen to be the ones that are promoting the democracy. You take every one of these countries, same issue. And so, but in terms of where else okay, let's take the pandemic, where India has been trying to put some pressure on the Chinese. Clearly, having an independent investigation into the pandemic is something that Australia introduced. And if it had gone forward, because the Chinese reacted and put boycotts on Australian products and so on, but these are the kind of things that the Indians would have jumped on the bandwagon. And the Chinese had to be worried about those kinds of things. Okay, but the way in which India has used the relationship with Japan for a Asia-Africa growth corridor, they have essentially almost trying to come up with an alternative to the Chinese. So which they are inviting all the neighboring countries to join. Japan brings a lot of advantages there as well. Okay, so I think the Indians are doing it. I think they could do a much better job. I also think that India has not treated its neighbors with the kind of respect that they should have gotten years before. I think they kind of thought that they're in our backyard, we can ignore them. So Modi has learned kind of the hard way that you're going to have a neighborhood first policy. And that's one thing that he's tried to get going. But everything is a little bit on hold given the pandemic and the fact that, but I think in the broader scheme of things, yes, it is leveraging other countries. And I think the other countries are seeing the need for it, given the threat that they see from China. And economics, frankly, also. But more because of the strategic. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that answer and for that question, Max. We're just about out of time, so I want to ask Dr. Ollapally if you want to share any closing remarks. And if you could, I know this may be a tall ask, but we do have one question that we weren't able to get to. So if you could incorporate a little bit of the role of the fact that China and India are nuclear powers as well into this closing response, we would really appreciate that. But any closing words you have for us?
Okay, well, let me just say that I'm not losing any sleep over the nuclear rivalry between India and China because of a border incident. They do have a no first use. Now, no first use is as good as the paper is written on. On the other hand, these countries are rational actors in this case. No one, if you notice, that issue doesn't even come up. It's all at the conventional level. But if the conventional level, if the conventional capabilities keep rising beyond, a point where they get to almost equal, and where it's high, then the role of nuclear could come in, but I'm not going to predict that at all. So I think it shows that they're very prudent and rational actors, frankly. And so the thing I want to leave with, though, is that I didn't mention was, of course, there's a big change right now that both India and China are facing, strictly globally, the Biden administration, which is going to have possibly a fairly, significant impact. And the question is whether or not Biden is going to be much more, Biden's first priority is going to have to be domestic economics. I mean, he's going to have to get control over the pandemic. But after that, are they going to go through things like decouple or at least diversify away from Chinese manufacturing? Because what the pandemic has shown is that the concentration of supply chains is a dangerous thing, not a very smart thing. and how will that affect the relations with China, and also opportunities for countries like India, and I should say Taiwan, because one of the things that's happening is because the Taiwanese have a huge number of high-tech and manufacturing companies in China, and they're looking for new places to go. One of their big targets is India. And by the way, to come back to that point from Max, I think the Indians have become, are stepping up their relations with Taiwan as a way to put pressure on China, to hold that up. They're not saying it's not the one China policy, but they're certainly putting out feelers to do more. So I think one big thing I want to say is that my own sense is that the Biden administration will keep its the importance that it has, that India has for the U.S. Biden was under Obama, and that's when many of these big U.S.-India agreements were signed, actually. On the other hand, I think what Biden will do is try to get a more sort of, maybe dial it down with Chinese. That will have some impact on India's openings and what it can do in terms of China as well. But I think the other point is that Biden may also question India more on its democracy, on the Modi government's Citizenship Amendment Act, what is done in Kashmir and so forth. So I think India is going to be on notice a little bit more on that. So I'll end with the Biden note.
Definitely something important for everyone to keep their eyes on. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ollapally, and thank you to everyone who joined. For those of you who have been to Foreign Affairs with Future Leaders events before, what we like to do at the end is take a nice group photo with anyone who is interested in sharing their screen. So if you prefer not to, that's fine. But if you'd like to, we encourage you to share your screen, and I'll take a group photo. I'll give everyone a few seconds to decide whether they want to or not, and then we'll be on our way.
You guys really have some good ideas. I'm going to have to use some of this.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Feel free to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take it now. So ready? All right, 1, 2. Got it. All right, well, perfect. Well, thank you very, very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the O'Neill Institute, the DP, Professional Foreign Service, Fraternity and Sorority at GWU, and thank you again to everyone for joining. And of course, thank you to the Rising Powers Initiative and the Speaker Center for their help in promoting this event. I really, really do appreciate you joining. I'm going to paste some contact information for the orgs that were involved in this, and please, we encourage you to come back to our next event, which will be on Friday, November 20th, talking about the Organization of American States and Human Rights. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and take care until next time. Have a great one, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of the weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking, Dr. Ollapally.
Thank you
so much.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.